Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I think this is a great initiative. Sometimes it's important that you're able to step back from what's happening day to day, sort of take a deep breath and look at the long-term challenges and what we can learn from history. Now, I'm going to talk not about the Latvian economy, because it would be presumptuous for me to try to give advice about an economy that I don't know so well. I will talk instead of my own native country, Sweden, what happened in Sweden in the 90s, big, deep recession, how we got out of it, what you might possibly learn from that. But then I will try to look ahead at the challenges for the future for the welfare state, the Nordic welfare state. Now, right now, we are doing pretty well. Most of you probably saw this cover from The Economist a couple of months ago, where The Economist depicted this handsome young Viking as the next supermodel, saying that if you sort of had to choose where in the world you'd like to be born today, you'd probably want to be born in the Nordic countries, because that is the best place to live. And this interest in the Nordic model was revived some years ago. This is a picture from the Davos annual World Economic Forum Summit 2 years ago, where there was a big panel on the Nordic model after the crisis. You can see 2 Nordic presidents, Finland and Iceland, and 3 prime ministers from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And of course, to the left is the moderator, me, and you and I know that the moderator is the most important person on the stage, of course. There was great interest in the Nordic model and why it had improved. Now, this wasn't always the case. If you look back to Sweden, Sweden did well in the 50s and 60s, but in the 70s and 80s, we had increasing problems. And I would say, actually, that the old sort of welfare model cracked in the 1970s and 80s. We had a bad period of slow growth, high inflation, low productivity growth, budget deficits, current account deficits, everything really. And then on top of that came a financial and real estate crisis, a bubble which burst in the early 90s, and we had a very deep recession, similar to the one that you had in Latvia some years ago and Southern Europe has still today. We had currency crisis, banking crisis, you name it, we had it. And this was very traumatic for the Swedish populations. Swedes had until then been quite cocky and proud. You know, we were God's own chosen people. Sweden could do nothing wrong. And then suddenly this view of the world just cracked. That was sad. It was tragic. It was very depressive. But it made it possible to push through very deep and far-reaching economic reforms. And I will not read them out to you. Those of you who can see it there. The slides, if you want them, will be available afterwards from the organizers. But we sort of did everything at once. We entered the European Union after staying outside. We made a great budget reform, which not only meant austerity for some years, but also changed the rules of the budget, meaning we had to show surplus, meaning that we had 3-year budget limits, a number of things that sort of tightened up the budget process. We had deregulated markets in a number of different markets, utilities. Also some of the welfare sectors were opened up for private competition. We had a very brutal rearrangement of the banking sector through a special plenipotentiary authority, a banking authority, which closed down some banks, restructured others, moved bad assets from the good banks into bad banks, workout companies, which had to sell them later on. And then, of course, we had a pension reform, moving from a system which was defined by benefits, promises, to a system which is now defined by how the economy works. Good growth gives higher pension, low growth gives lower pensions. That's more important than the previous promises of the pension system. So there was, and then of course finally a big change of monetary policy, going from a fixed exchange rate to a floating rate, going to an inflation target with central bank independence. So there was a total sort of overhaul of the Swedish policy making that happened within just a couple of few years actually in the mid-90s and early 90s. And my opinion is, of course, that this is what the Club Med, this is what the Southern European countries ought to do, but haven't been able to do for a number of reasons. The results, without bragging and without numbers, The banks are now well consolidated. We went from deficits to surpluses, both in the budget and in the current account, that is the trade. Government debt has been falling sharply and is now far, far below the old Maastricht sort of limit which the Eurozone countries are supposed to follow. We've had lower inflation than the European countries in general, in average, since the mid-90s, with ensuing low interest rates. Unemployment has come down, but is still higher than before the crisis. That is sort of the black spot on the shining shield. But in average, the Swedish economy is doing much, much better now than previously. And of course, I would say primarily because of the reforms that came through the crisis. The Nordic countries, the other Nordic countries, had a similar experience, especially in Finland, which was very similar to the Swedish case, but also Denmark and Norway had their crisis, although milder than the Finnish and Swedish crises. And if you look at the Nordic region today, this is difficult to see, I know that, but this is also from the World Economic Forum. They've measured competitiveness in a number of different ways. The idea is to get as far out from the middle as possible. And they compare in a number of ways the Nordic countries in blue, the US in yellow, and the European Union in red. And as you can see, if you sit if you sit close enough, you can see that the blue line here is further out than the red line in all areas, i.e. the Nordics are much more competitive than the Europe as a whole in all areas. We are less competitive in the US when it comes to market size. Obviously, the US is a bigger country. And according to these measurements, also as regards labor market, which I would question, I actually think that the Nordic model with its flex-security system is superior to the American labor market. But that's another issue. The point is that the Nordics as a group are ranked very high when it comes to competitiveness. And as you heard from the previous speaker, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, and so on are always ranked very high as individual countries in these rankings. There's a number of attempts to explain this. I gave you sort of the facts, what happened in the 90s, but the question then is, of course, why did it happen? Why were the Nordics able to do this when the southern European countries cannot do it now? I think maybe I'm too sociological here, but I think there's one explanation can be found in the peculiar Nordic societies and our history. This is, and of course, in particular Sweden. These are old countries, and they're small. They have been pretty homogeneous, and they have been characterized by this peculiar combination of big unions, big government on the one hand, but also openness and readiness to innovate. We have sort of an ambition to combine equity with efficiency. It's not Anglo-Saxon capitalism, but it's not either the rigid sort of regulated kind of capitalism or regulated economies that you see in continental Europe. It's a very peculiar mixture of egalitarianism, high taxes, and free markets with individualism. There are some historians who, when they looked at Sweden, say that, sure, Sweden has high taxes and we have sort of a big welfare state, but the point of the welfare state is actually to liberate the individual, because women are liberated from their husbands because of maternity leave. Children are liberated from their families because of free education, etc., etc., etc. So the welfare state sort of gives the individual a platform from which to develop. And I think that I think they exaggerate a little bit, but it's a good point. And it also gives an explanation why the Nordic countries can be, on the one hand, welfare states, but also very individualistic and very innovative. And of course, there's one more important factor, and that is that we have, I know this is unreadable, it's a kind of measurement of trust or lack of corruption. Down here, we measure sort of how open, transparent, and non-corrupt the institutions are, and on the vertical scale, we measure competitiveness. And the four Nordic countries are extreme outliers, as you can see. They are the ones who are furthest up and furthest to the right. They are the least corrupt countries in the world, in a sense, with the highest trust. And I think that is almost impossible to emulate. That's sort of an effect of hundreds of years of history. Well, so far so good. We managed the crisis, we got through the crisis, we are in a better shape today. But what about the future? Can we rest on our laurels? Surely not, because the world is changing. 2 years ago, the Swedish government set up what was called a Commission for the Future, led by the Prime Minister, with also 4 cabinet ministers, party leaders actually from different coalition parties in the Swedish government, and 9 so-called external experts. And I was one of them. I was the economist in the group. Our task was to look at the long-term challenges to Sweden and the welfare state. Not this year or next year, but 20 years ahead. What were the challenges facing Sweden, and what could we possibly do about them? Now, of course, we identified a number of challenges, and I will not have time to run through them all. In particular, I will leave out the environmental challenge, because that is a sort of, in a sense, a subject of its own. It's a question of how to green the economy. I will not talk about that. I will talk about sort of the more traditional challenges, and then come to the solutions. One obvious challenge is globalization, and the global value chains, the new phase of globalization where you don't have countries trading with each other. You have multinational companies having production facilities, R&D facilities, sales promotion facilities in many countries. So you have a matrix of production and internal services within the firm. And that means you have competition of tasks, where it's not really wage cost that matters the way it was. It's whether the service or job is movable or not. And that has less to do with wage cost and much more to do, and not as much with education as you might think. The obvious case, and I hope I'm not gender impolitical by having a man and a woman here, but the obvious case is healthcare, where the radiologist can be anywhere in the world, in Bangalore, and on the screen see what's happening in your lungs here in Riga. But the nurse who is to give the vaccine or to change the diapers of the young or the elderly, whatever, she or he cannot be moved. She has to stay here. And that is a new environment of globalization with new challenges. Can we be able to innovate and stay open in that environment? Second challenge, of course, is that we're getting older. Sweden has already changed its pension system. It's much more robust now, like I said. Many other countries have not. But also in Sweden, we're facing a future where the costs of healthcare will increase as the population gets older. And that is a challenge to all of us. Will we be able to finance that, or do we have to have high taxes again, or can we find other solutions to that challenge? The third challenge is the labor market. I said previously that we still have high unemployment in Sweden. And not only that, we have very high youth unemployment, higher than most other countries in Europe. And to a large extent, this depends on that the Swedish school system is not working very well. Kids get out of school without good enough grades. They have difficulties getting into the labor market. And part of it also depends on immigration. We have had a lot of immigration in recent years. I totally agree with Sol Singer that is potentially a huge boon. It's a great source of innovation and entrepreneurship. But the problem in Sweden is that our labor market is still too rigid. The thresholds to get into the labor market are too high. And that means that it's difficult for some of these young people coming from abroad to get into the labor market. So they stay outside, and we have sort of more or less ghettos in some of the suburbs in the big cities. And this is a huge threat to the old Swedish cohesiveness of society, when you have big groups of immigrant, angry young men who are outside with the realms of society. And I think Denmark has the same problem. Finland does not really. Norway has increasing problems that way. Looks almost the same in most Nordic countries. So what can we do? The Commission didn't say much about that because the chairman, the Prime Minister, was very careful not to say too much. But as a member of the Commission, I'm free to say what I think the solutions are. So obviously I think the first and most important one when it comes to economics is to build a much more dynamic economy. We have to build and spread knowledge. I also here totally agree with the speaker, Sol Singer, when he said that you shouldn't overemphasize R&D in big companies, hoping for the big technological breakthroughs, the new Nokias or the new Pharmas or whatever. Sure, you might succeed. But countries like Finland, Latvia, and Sweden, we are very, very small. We cannot really trust that we, as 0.1% of the global population will be able to come up with the great new technological inventions. For us, it's much more important to be able to spread knowledge across the economy and to have a general sort of climate of entrepreneurship and dynamism. And that means we have a much broader task to create a creative society. And I also there agree with what Singer said. This means that we have to encourage the shape, the creation of SMEs. We have to overhaul taxes and regulations. We have to sort of climb down from politicians must not harass small entrepreneurs. And of course we need to build infrastructure, both digital and analog, to sort of simplify things for the entrepreneurs. Second recipe is that we shouldn't be too cocky when it comes to the labor market. The Nordic countries in general sort of say that we want to build a labor market, a society where everybody has good education, everybody has a high salary, and so on and so forth. But that means that you actually shut out a large number of people who are not very productive and not interested in higher education. So we need a labor market which walks on two legs, with lower thresholds for those people who are coming into the labor market, not to exclude them. We need to improve the way that schools and business work together. It's not by chance that Germany has the lowest youth unemployment in Europe, because they have these vocational schools where young people sort of have a smooth transition out to business and to labor markets. So I think this change of the labor market is very important for the Nordic countries in general and Sweden in particular. And then as regards financing the welfare state and the welfare system, I don't think there's any way we can avoid working more hours and working more years. The pension system actually means that if you want a good pension, you have to work longer years, which is not strange. The pension systems were built in a period where people lived much shorter, as you heard when Staffan showed you sort of the bubbles moving up into the corners where people now live much longer. And this, of course, that the pension system means that the pension systems must be changed accordingly. But when it comes to health care, I think it's important to move along the way that Sweden has started to move, to try to find ways for private business and taxpayers, the public sector, to cooperate. The bulk of the welfare, i.e. education and health care in Sweden, is financed by public money, by taxes. But the public sector can buy health care, hospitals, services, schools, etc., from the private sector. So the private sector can compete with the public schools, and the public schools themselves compete among each other for taxpayers' money. I think that's one way of sort of making a market mechanism come into the welfare sector to increase productivity. That's quite controversial in Sweden. There's been big debate about it, and there are some good or bad examples of private entrepreneurs sort of mistreating their task in the welfare sector. But this simply means to me that we need to have better quality control, but we still need that kind of competition within the welfare sector that we have started. We have embarked on that road, and I think we should continue. That's a way of modernizing the model. Now, what does this mean? You're getting tired. If I want to summarize everything I've said in a couple of snappy sentences, what do I say? Well, if you do get into a crisis, you shouldn't waste it. To quote Barack Obama's previous chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, never waste a good crisis. If you are unlucky to get into a crisis, then things happen. Political situation changes. Suddenly things that were impossible to do in good times are possible to do. It's the same in politics, but it's also the same in companies also. When companies are good, they usually become lazy. When they are pressurized, when they need to transform, they do it better. And so you shouldn't waste the crisis. You should bite the bullet. You should make as comprehensive reforms as possible. And I showed you the list of what we did in Sweden in the early 90s. That was a long list, much longer than anybody could have guessed would have been pushed through just some years before that. But when you're out of the crisis, you need to prepare for the future. And the future is, of course, impossible to forecast. I've been in forecasting for 25 years as an economist, and my forecasts never are right, because so many things happen. And that's why, I mean, you have to have you have to be content with knowing in the general sort of direction where society is heading, but then you have to try to build dynamism, flexibility into your economy and to new politics. And that means, like I said, creating a much more entrepreneurial society. I think that is the most important task for the mature welfare states that the Nordic countries have. So those are my two sort of lessons from the Swedish crisis in the early 90s. I'm not sure what you can learn or use from that, because you have gone through your own crisis, you bit the bullet as hard as anybody ever did. But looking at the future, I think it is important that all small countries think about dynamism, openness, and entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eklund. And here comes the questions. Is there also any bad aspects which came after all of those reforms in Sweden? Probably you can mention and describe them.
The bad aspects? Well, the pressure on the economy was so great, and the scrapping of old capital in industry was so huge, that the industrial sort of sector first shrank a lot, and that created unemployment. And like I said, the labor market is still too rigid. It's been impossible to get unemployment down. We're stuck with high unemployment. And that, I think, is the worst effect of the crisis. It's taken a long, long time to stop the rise of unemployment, and it's going to take a long time to get it down, unless we do these reforms that I talked about. Other people will claim also that probably the distribution of income has become too skewed. The difference between the rich and the poor has increased. But I think, yeah, I don't like that either. But I don't think it's particularly Swedish. I think that's happening almost all over the world as a result of globalization, the pressure from low-cost countries, and technical development where you need to be more educated to handle sophisticated machines and things like that. So I don't think that's well, it's partly because of the crisis and the reforms, but the main cause of that is really a bigger picture, global picture.
Okay, and actually a bit more detailed question regarding the welfare. We know that the old welfare model of Nordic countries means higher taxes in order to have a social safety stability in return. And we know that this model has transformed and is transforming already today. Could you give some examples which taxes has been reduced and which social services today are not available or actually is limited in the context of the reforms?
There were two waves of tax reforms, actually. There was a big tax reform in the early 90s where the top marginal tax rates on income came down sharply, and the tax base was broadened. VAT tax, the value-added tax, that is, tax on the environment, things like that, were hiked instead. But the total tax level stayed pretty high, but the tax system became more sound. It didn't create as much distortions as previously. The second wave of tax reforms have taken place during the present government, quite controversial, but they have continued to push down income tax quite sharply, not for the rich, but for the sort of median earner, nurses, policemen, things like that, you know, to make it easier for them to have sort of a positive wage development. So total tax ratio has come down. We are not the country with the biggest public sector anymore. We used to be, we're not. Denmark is now bigger than Sweden, Denmark's public sector, and a few others actually. We are much more of a normal European country in that sense. As regards the welfare services, there has not been any big revolutionary changes. Some fees have gone up, but I think the more important thing is that some of the benefits on the transfer side have been cut. The sick allowance or allowance system is not as generous as it was back in the 80s. You can't get 100% of your salary if you're homesick. Things like that, which I think is not too strange to change it that way. But it's been politically controversial, of course.
The question, Latvia has advertised its economic success story to overcome the crisis on a stability, which brought the real results. But actually the question is stability such as a welcome thing if the aim or the mission is to reach dynamic economy?
This is a philosophical, almost religious question.
That has been asked.
If you look at the public budget, I think stability is extremely important. That's why I'm all in favor of the kind of surplus targets that we have in Sweden, because it means that when the crisis comes, you have buffers. So I'm very much in favor of budget stability. But of course, when it comes to the economy as a whole, we don't want a stable, non-changing economy. We want what Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, called creative destruction. We want new business to grow, but then, of course, if the new business is to grow, old business must die. That's sort of the way of life. You cannot have an economy where old business just survives and survives and survives. If the economy is supposed to change, be dynamic, you have to have new companies alongside with dying companies. But that's exactly why the labor market is so important, because it has to be flexible. People who are sort of losing their job on the old side of the economy must be able to move over and find new jobs in the new side of the economy. And if that's not happening, then you get high unemployment. So you need a dynamic economy with lots of change, and not that kind of stability which prevents old companies from dying.
The SCB recently moved the back office services to Latvia. Do you think that Latvia becomes more like India when it comes to the business
more like
support?
India? Well, you're a bit smaller.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, the move of that kind of services was quite successful, and we're continuing to do that. I work mainly in the southern city of Malmö, southern Sweden, where we still have some of back office's functions still left, but these are the last ones. They are now moving to Latvia, and we've had Latvian colleagues coming in, teaching our Malmö people how to improve before the jobs are moved to Latvia. And I don't see any end to that. I see that continuing. But of course, India can be a challenge because their costs are lower, and technology doesn't really matter where you sit. But to a certain extent, I think geographical proximity and cultural proximity is important. So as far as I know, I think Latvia is still very attractive for Swedish back office functions.
Where do you see the growth potential for such as small countries as Baltic, for example, and taking into account that we are not able to pay just higher taxes or just to increase them, and we have very limited resources to invest in education and science?
Sure, these are sort of threats or obstacles, but they're also opportunities. This simply means that we have to work harder in other ways, in other areas. We have heard a lot about other countries that are similar in a sense. Singapore, small country, no natural resources, but they succeed anyway. And partly because they have to work harder in other areas to compensate for the lack of natural resources. So I mean, there's no natural law saying that small countries without natural resources are bound to be poor. On the other hand, if you can turn it into your advantage. Like many speakers have said already, if you're a small country, then you have to expand internationally. You have to shape up. You have to be good. You have to be international. And why should you be able to do that?
Tusen tack! Klāss Eklunds.